Welcome to this online reflection, which we're offering through the Northwestern Baptist Association. But anyone and everyone is welcome to use it, and however you are using it or sharing it, I hope you find it helpful. Some years ago, I had the opportunity to visit a Roman villa. Now, in the brochure that I was given, and in fact on the signboards when I arrived, were pictures of a lovely family home with tiled roofs and courtyards and people in Roman tunics all happily smiling as they lived there. So I was a little bit surprised to discover that reality was rather different. I mean, to be fair, there was a lovely coffee shop and a very nice visitor centre with all kinds of Roman artefacts displayed in lovely shiny cabinets. But when we got to the actual site of the villa, there wasn't actually that much to see. In fact, most of it consisted of lines of bricks in the grass, and it looked far more like a giant architect's drawing than a villa. But of course, this was the site of a genuine Roman villa. Over the course of the centuries, most of the walls had fallen down and, according to the guides, had been carted away by various generations of locals to build their own homes. But the foundations remained. And all of those pictures in the brochure and on the signboards were not just some flight of fancy or some figment of someone's imagination, but they'd been very carefully constructed by experts who had studied these foundations, and they'd analysed the soil and the debris so that they were able to tell us where the kitchen had been and where the rubbish dump was and so on. And when everything else had been stripped away, those foundations still remained, and those foundations were still able to tell their story. Thousands of years later, people were able to recognize what had once stood there and what it once would have looked like. And I guess you can already see where I'm going with this, because we could certainly describe the experience of the last year or so right across the world as one in which a great deal has been stripped away. And that's not just a matter of lamenting that we can't go to church or that we've missed a holiday or two, but we've really been stopped in our tracks and made to consider what really matters in life. You know, we've been confronted with the true fragility of human life. We've been faced with our own vulnerability, and we've begun to recognise what does really matter and what doesn't. Life, we might say, has been stripped to its foundations. And that is something that as a community of faith, we've not been exempt from. So much of what occupied our attention and defined us as a community of God's people has also been stripped to its foundations. And yes, at one level, that's been troubling and that's been disappointing and that's been frustrating. But perhaps it's also enabled us to see what our foundations are really like. A couple of weeks ago, I put together one of these reflections around some early statements from the book of Deuteronomy in the Old Testament. And I made the point that this and its sister book, Leviticus, are a catalogue of some of the most diverse and all-encompassing law codes that you could ever imagine. They include issues of food hygiene, sexual morality, trade justice, financial management, building regulations, and so I could go on. But the point I made was that for all their diversity and in places incredible detail, these laws have one simple foundation. Love the Lord your God with everything you've got and love your neighbour as yourself. Now, very few of us are likely to argue with that. And it's not that difficult to translate this principle into our lives as Christians. Yes, we attend our services of worship and we're involved in the activities of our local congregation, and we attend some of those practical tasks that need to be done, like mowing the grass around the church building or helping with the accounts or whatever else it might be. And we recognise this underlying theological principle that these things are all built on a foundation of love for God and love for one another. Now, that's pretty easy to work out in theory. But I guess the question that we can't avoid is to ask whether this is true in practice. Now that all those things have been stripped to their foundations, so to speak, is it love that remains? Is it love that defines what once stood there and what might yet perhaps stand there again? What would be the equivalent of architects turning up at the site of that Roman villa and being able to examine the traces and the remnants of our life together? And if they did, would they be able to recognize that everything that we'd built, everything that we'd done together, was an expression of love? And for me, this raises another question. What is love? You know, lots of people have made the point that while everyone can say that they know what love is, it isn't something that you can hold in your hand or put in one of those shiny display cabinets and say, there you go, that's love. We may be able to produce symbols of love, we may be able to recite words of love, but what is love? And of course, love can mean different things. I love Raspberry Ripple ice cream, especially the Raspberry Ripple ice cream that they sell in the shop down the road from the office that I haven't been able to visit for the last 9 months. I love going on holiday to mid Wales. And when I say things like that, people recognise what I mean. It's a genuine statement. But the love that we speak of in relation to ice cream and holidays isn't quite the same as what we mean when we might say, I love my husband or I love my wife. And for that matter, the love that we have for a life partner is very similar, but it's not quite the same as the love we might have for our children or our parents or a brother or a sister or a best friend. Love can mean many different things, similar things, but nonetheless different. Now, over the last few of these reflections, I've been inviting you to ponder the words of Jesus first recorded in John chapter 13. This is how everyone will know that you're my disciples if you have love one for another. So if love can be so many different things, what kind of love is Jesus talking about when he calls us to love one another? And what do we mean when we say we love one another? We might love being together, we might love the things that we do together, but that's something different from loving one another. And one of the people who seeks to answer that question, what is love, is the New Testament writer and apostle Paul, in a series of letters that he sends to some of the early churches to encourage them to put the words of Jesus into practice. And I want to invite us to take a look at a paragraph from one of those letters for a few moments. And it's his letter to the church in Rome. And we're going to read Romans chapter 12, verses 9 to 18. And this is what he says. Love must be sincere. Hate what is evil. Cling to what is good. Be devoted to one another in love. Honour one another above yourselves. Never be lacking in zeal, but keep your spiritual fervour serving the Lord. Be joyful in hope, patient in affliction, faithful in prayer. Share with the Lord's people who are in need. Practice hospitality. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Mourn with those who mourn. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be proud, but be willing to associate with people of low position. Do not be conceited. And do not repay anyone evil for evil, but be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everyone. Now, there's a huge amount that Paul says in these few short verses, and there is no way that I could do justice to it all in a 15-minute reflection. So, in all honesty, you could do worse than just finding yourself a decent slot of time and sitting down with a brew and finding those words in the Bible and simply let God speak to you through them. But let me offer you a few things that I've noticed that might help you to do that. Earlier, I recognise the fact that we can often use the word love in different ways. When we say we love ice cream, it doesn't quite mean the same as saying that we love a wife or a husband or a close friend. And one thing we might not realise is that the New Testament, when it was originally written, actually used several different Greek words for that word that we now translate as love. And there are two of them here in verses 9 and 10. The first of those, in verse 9, love must be sincere or love must be genuine is the word agape, which the early church used as an expression to define the love of God. And in verse 10, he uses the word Philadelphos, which, yes, is the same word that gives its name to the American city, Philadelphia, and it's translated by some as affection or brotherly love. And if you translated it literally, verse 9 kind of says, love, agape love, is not hypocritical. Now, that's a strong word, and hypocrisy is when we say one thing and do something else. So what is Paul getting at here? What's he trying to say? Well, I think the point that he's making is that the love that we have for each other, the way that we treat each other, the actions that we take in respect of each other, cannot be a contradiction of what we believe about God's love. And you can see that he's been influenced by those words of Jesus that say, this is how the world will recognize you, by the love that you have for each other. Because if we don't reflect God's love in the way that we treat each other, then we will make God's love to be something of a hypocrisy. I think that's what Paul is trying to say here. This is how the world will know, says Jesus, not because you explain God's love, but because you demonstrate it in the way that you treat one another. Adelphos, your affection for each other, and agape, God's love for you, need to be indistinguishable. They need to be seen as one in the same. Just like those foundations were a lasting testimony to the house that had once been built at the site of that Roman villa. God's love needs to be traceable into the foundations of what we do. That needs to be the reality that marks out what we are. And this 12th chapter of Romans is a bit of a hinge point in the narrative. It begins in verse 1 with the word therefore, and that usually marks a switch in Paul's writing. I've given you all the theory, I've explained all the doctrine, now this is how we need to put it into practice. You see, he uses that word therefore quite a lot in his writing. And if you're familiar with the book of Romans, you'll know that the previous 11 chapters contain some of the most detailed and thorough explanations of our Christian faith that there are. But this is nonetheless a therefore moment. This doctrine, these explanations are important and significant, but we're not called to simply believe them, we're called to live them out. And so we can use the statements that follow to move us from simply affirming that God is love and agreeing that we're called to love one another, to think about how that will affect the way we live our lives today, on the things that we're going to do this week, on the way that we treat people and on what we do and what we do not consider to be important. And the first of those we've pretty much already said. Love is expressed through practical actions. Verse 13, love must be sincere. Hate what is evil. Cling to what is good. Be intentional in your actions. Verse 16, live in harmony with each other. Don't be choosy about who you associate with. And if you continue reading this through to verse 20, even if we're talking about those who might be considered as our enemies, if they're hungry, give them something to eat. If they're thirsty, give them something to drink. You know how often we talk about God's love being unconditional, freely given and undeserved. Well, our love for others is encouraged to be the same, a true reflection of what we believe about God's love for us. And again, at a time when our regular activities are denied us, there is nothing stopping us from fostering this kind of attitude towards one another. And the second thing I want us to notice is that love places the interests of others above our own. Verse 10. Honour one another above yourselves. And we've already noticed the radical extent of this as we are invited to show that same attitude towards our enemies. And this is echoed again in verse 14. Bless those who persecute you. Bless, do not curse. And then in verse 15, rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. And right now there's an awful lot of people in our communities who need us to weep with them. But just stand back. from that familiar statement for a moment and recognize the dynamics behind it. Let others set the emotional agenda. Let your mood be set by their needs. Don't impose your feelings on them. This is all about being invited to place the interests of others above our own, because that's what love does. And the third thing that I invite you to just recognize is that love gives us the strength and the resources to serve God. I guess we've all been in that place at some time or other when we have realized just how draining and debilitating it can be when people are unkind and critical towards us. It just becomes so wearying as it saps us of all our energy. But Paul has a vision of a church that isn't lacking in zeal. It's full of enthusiasm and spiritual fervour. It's ready to serve the Lord. And the point I've just made reminds us that how we treat one another can hugely impact on that. And this isn't some obligation that Paul is seeking to place on their shoulders. He is recognizing how this is fostered through being part of a genuinely loving community. And Paul is very real about the fact that we might often find ourselves in difficult circumstances. Verse 14 acknowledges that we may well be persecuted. Verse 12, we will suffer affliction. And verse 17, there will be times when what is meted out on us is simply evil. But love is our resource to carry us through these kind of challenges. It's love that gives us the strength not to retaliate and not to strike back. So as we recognize again this command of Jesus to love one another, we are reminded through these verses in Romans that this is not some theoretical ideal, but something that needs to find expression in our lives and in our attitudes and in our actions. These are the hallmarks of a Christian community that gives the right priority to what Jesus calls us to be. And let's be clear. As I said a couple of moments ago, this is not a list of obligations. This is not a series of expectations that we are called to dutifully reenact instead of loving each other. That's the equivalent of building a house without a foundation, so there'll be nothing to see when our activities are cleared away. These are the expressions of love. This is not just how the world will know that we are true disciples of Jesus. This is how we will know that we are those disciples. Thanks for listening.